I want to be clear about one thing before I tell you how it started. I did not enter the tournament of claim on purpose. That matters. The Vel'Keth court spent the better part of 4 days convinced I was a spy, a saboteur, a deliberate insult dispatched by the compact to humiliate their sovereign line, because no rational being, they reasoned, would enter voluntarily knowing what the trials involved. They were correct on the last point. I would not have entered voluntarily. I didn't. A protocol officer named Thesavar Alm, who I have since been told retired quietly under significant administrative pressure, misread the compact trade mission's personnel manifest and interpreted specialist field operations as equivalent to formal combat petitioner. He submitted the application. He stamped it, he had it witnessed. By the time the error surfaced, Vel'Keth tournament law had already taken hold of me like a tide. You may withdraw a petition before the first witness seal, the court archivist explained to me with the careful flatness of someone delivering information he expected to be disputed. After the first witness seal, withdrawal requires formal surrender with loss of standing, a recorded dereliction notation in the compact diplomatic register, and full assumption of all logistical and honor costs incurred by the accepting house. I asked what the honor costs amounted to. He told me. I did not withdraw. My name is Cale Dorn. I was 38 years old when the Vel'Keth tournament of claim accepted my petition without my knowledge. I had spent 15 years as a frontier scout for the Compact's Territorial Survey Division before the division was restructured out of existence, and I was reassigned, laterally, as they put it, to cultural observation work on diplomatic trade missions. It was quieter work. It suited me. I was good at staying out of the way and writing accurate reports, and there is more demand for that skill than most people expect. I was not a soldier. I had never held a formal military rank. My physical fitness was the functional kind that comes from years of moving through terrain that wants to kill you, nothing celebrated, nothing dramatic. I did not look like what the Vel'Keth court expected when they looked at the roster of petitioners for the 41st tournament of claim. The other 4 petitioners were Sorvin Kalath, second son of the Vel'Keth Northern House, trained since the age of 9, decorated in 3 border engagements, 6 feet and 4 inches of what the Vel'Keth considered ideal physical form. Draven Sorvin, a mercenary commander who had won the last 2 open tournaments on different worlds, entered here as a client of the Eastern House. 2 others whose names I learned but whose distinguishing characteristics blurred together in retrospect, noble sons of mid-tier houses, both larger than me, both with braid counts on their armor that meant something in Vel'Keth hierarchy and nothing in mine. I was 5 feet 11, had a scar along my left jaw from a survey incident involving something that turned out not to be a boulder, wore the Compact's plain gray mission jacket with the Trade Division patch, and had arrived that morning carrying a field notebook and a cup of their local grain tea, which was terrible. The announcement of my inclusion in the petitioner roster produced, I was told later, approximately 40 seconds of complete silence in the court gallery, followed by laughter. The laughter had a specific quality, not the sharp contempt of a crowd that feels threatened, but the loose, generous laughter of people who do not expect to be surprised by what comes next. It was the laughter of a foregone conclusion. I was not present for it. I was still in the archivist's office trying to understand the honor costs, and then I was in my quarters reading the trial specifications with a cup of bad grain tea, and then I was sleeping, because I have learned that sleeping adequately before a day of unknown difficulty is one of the more reliable advantages available to a person who is otherwise disadvantaged. The Tournament of Claim was an ancient Vel'Keth institution. The current sovereign's second heir, the princess, could only be formally bonded through the tournament unless she withdrew her claim to succession, which she had declined to do. The petitioner who completed all 5 trials accrued the highest cumulative score across the first 4, and then satisfied the fifth trial to the princess's sole judgment, won the formal bonding claim. The princess retained the right to refuse at the fifth trial. She could not refuse before it. I read the full trial specifications that evening in my quarters. I read them twice. Then I sat with the grain tea. It did not improve with time, and I thought about terrain. Every environment I had ever worked in was trying to do something to you. Desert terrain dehydrated you, disoriented you, reflected heat at angles you didn't expect. Forest terrain hid your sight lines and made sound behave strangely. High-altitude terrain compressed your decisions because your body was slower and the margins were smaller. Ice terrain punished hesitation. The frontier had 100 ways to tell you it wanted you to fail, and the ones who lasted learned to listen to what the terrain was actually saying rather than what they expected it to say. The trial specifications described 5 events. I read them again with that framework in mind. Trial 1. The Traverse. A 12-kilometer course through the Fortress Palace's outer approach terrain, rocky escarpment, low scrub, 2 river crossings, elevation gain of 800 meters over the final third. Timed. Fastest completion wins the trial. Trial 2. The Endurance. A sustained load carry over 6 hours in the fortress's inner exercise yard. Weight increases every 40 minutes. Last man standing wins. Trial 3. Single combat with a weapons specialist of the host house's choosing. 3 rounds, point-based. Trial 4. Tactical Command. Petitioners lead a squad of 6 Vel'Keth house soldiers through a live objective scenario in the fortress's tactical training ground. Scored on objectives completed and unit cohesion. Trial 5. The Sovereign Proof. 1 question from the princess. Her judgment only. No scoring criteria published. I finished the tea. It had gone cold. The first thing I thought was, the Traverse is not a combat trial. It is a navigation and fitness trial. The fastest completion rewards speed over ground, and speed over ground is a function of route selection as much as raw physical output. The other petitioners would run the obvious line, the ridge. The ridge was the straightest path. It was also the most exposed to wind and the most technically demanding on the rock transitions. The riverbed approaches to the first crossing would be softer underfoot and shelter the wind at the cost of a longer initial distance. I could recover that distance on the back half if I took the intermediate shelf line rather than continuing to fight the ridge. The second thing I thought was, I do not know how to win Trial 3. I should think about the other 4 and not lose Trial 3 so badly that I'm eliminated. The third thing I thought was, I do not know what the 5th trial is because it has never been published. I should keep doing what I always do, which is pay attention to what is actually in front of me and describe it accurately. I slept adequately, which was more than I had managed some nights in the field. On the morning of Trial 1, I met the princess for the first time. It was not a formal meeting. It was a corridor, the eastern approach to the trial staging area, where the court's gallery observers were moving toward the overlook positions. She came around a corner with 2 advisors, and I was going the other direction, and we nearly walked into each other, and she said, in Vel'Keth standard, "Excuse me." And I said, "My fault." And we each stepped the same way and then the other way, and she made a small sound that might have been a suppressed laugh, and I moved left, and she moved right, and we passed. I had time to see her for about 4 seconds. She was slightly below average height for a Vel'Keth woman, which put her at my eye level. Pale blue-gray skin with the particular luminous quality I had noticed in the Vel'Keth high caste line. It caught light differently than human skin, held it briefly before releasing. Dark copper hair, the color of old metal wire, pulled back in the plain indoor fastening that Vel'Keth women of rank used when they weren't at ceremony. Amber eyes. Not gold, amber, the specific warm brown gold of tree resin, deep and slightly translucent at the outer edge. She was dressed without court ornamentation, the plain gray-blue of a senior observer. Her right hand, the one she'd raised slightly when we'd been about to collide, was held with a particular deliberateness. Not a gesture, not an affectation, but the specific careful carriage of someone managing something in that hand that required managing. She looked, I thought, like someone who had been waiting a long time for a question worth answering. I filed that and went to line up for the traverse. I finished Trial 1 in third place. The ridge line was faster for Sorvin Kalleth and Draven Sorvin, who had the specific muscular build that handles technical rock transitions efficiently and were, on that terrain, simply faster than me. I had expected that. What I had calculated correctly was the intermediate shelf, which cost me approximately 4 minutes on the first half and returned 6 on the back half, because the wind on the ridge that morning was coming off the eastern face at a sustained angle that cost both of them time I had already banked. Third place was 2 minutes behind second. The gap between second and fourth was 9 minutes. The gallery, I was told, had expected me to be last. Third produced a silence of a different quality than the announcement silence. I was not present for that either. I was in the field medical station having a blister on my left heel treated, which was a reasonable use of the recovery time. When I came back through the staging area and saw the completion board posted, I noticed the gallery overhead had not entirely dispersed. People were still at the rail, still looking at the board. One of the court observers, an older woman in house colors I didn't recognize, was saying something to the person next to her with an expression that I filed as recalibration. She had expected a number next to my name. The number was different than she expected, and she was adjusting her model. I understood that feeling. I had spent 15 years being wrong about terrain I thought I knew. Trial 2 I finished second. The endurance carry had a structure I recognized. The weight increments were calibrated to the Vel'Keth warriors' strength profiles, significant for them, but the elimination threshold was absolute rather than relative, which meant the question was not who was strongest but who was most efficient with their energy expenditure. I had spent 15 years carrying survey equipment over terrain that didn't want me there. I knew how to carry weight. I did not fight the load. I did not shift it constantly or attempt to redistribute it in ways that felt better in the moment but cost more over time. I found the minimum viable posture and held it and let the hours pass. There is a particular quality to sustained effort that most people experience as boredom, and I experience as a kind of clarity. When the variables narrow down to one, hold this, keep moving, do not stop, the mind goes somewhere useful. I thought about the tactical trial. I thought about the 5th trial. I spent a considerable portion of the 4th hour thinking about the specific amber of the princess's eyes, and the way she had held her right hand in the corridor, and what the nerve condition meant for how she moved through a world that had rules about weapons and combat and battle braids, and whether she had found it suffocating, or had simply learned to work around it. The way I worked around the scar tissue on my left jaw that still occasionally pulled unexpectedly in cold air. I did not arrive at conclusions. I stored the observations. Sorvin Kalleth won the trial. He was stronger than me and stayed efficient longer. One of the mid-tier noble sons was eliminated at the 6-hour mark with the load at its maximum increment. The other lasted 40 minutes past that before his form broke down entirely. Draven Sorvin finished third, approximately 20 minutes behind me. He was built for speed and single combat, and the endurance carry was not his terrain. After Trial 2, standing at the edge of the field with the load removed and the particular relief that comes when something heavy is no longer on your back, I heard someone in the gallery above the eastern wall say, distinctly, "The human is still standing." The tone was not quite what it had been on the first day. I looked up at the gallery. I was not trying to find anyone in particular. But the south end of the gallery, the section where the royal observers sat, held one figure in plain gray-blue who was looking at the field rather than at the other observers, and the amber eyes were visible even at that distance as a quality of attention, focused and still, in the way that genuinely interested observation is still, while everything around it moves. She was watching the field. She had been watching the field, I thought, for most of the trial. I filed it and went to find more grain tea. Trial 3 nearly ended it. The Vel'Keth weapons specialist assigned to the human petitioner was a woman named Sarvath Aln, no relation, as far as I could determine, to the protocol officer who had caused this entire situation, who was introduced as the fortress's third-ranked single combat instructor. She was somewhere in her mid-30s, Vel'Keth warrior build, long-limbed and precise, and she had the particular composure of a professional who has done this enough times that she is not required to feel anything about it. She fought with a paired blade form I had encountered in briefing documents, but never seen live. The two blades worked in a coordination pattern that was not sequential. They weren't simply 1-2, lead then follow, but something more like a simultaneous grammar, both doing different things that were part of one larger motion. It was elegant in the way that things are elegant when they have been refined over a long time by people who took them seriously. She looked at me when I stepped into the combat square the way Sarvath Aln had almost certainly looked at the terrain. She assessed it, catalogued it, and moved to what she expected the task to be. I was the task. She expected it to be brief. I did not pretend to compete with her on her terms. That would have been a shorter story. I knew before the first round began that I was not winning the trial outright. What I needed was to not lose all 3 rounds so completely that the point differential eliminated me from the overall standings. What I had was 4 minutes. First round, I lasted 4 minutes and 12 seconds before she scored the disabling point. For context, the prior competitors had averaged 2 minutes and 30 seconds against Sarvath Aln, with the exception of Sorvin Khalith, who lasted 5 minutes flat. 4 minutes and 12 seconds was not a victory. It was a form of not catastrophe. The gallery was watching. I was aware of it without looking up, the particular pressure of a large number of people who have stopped expecting a particular outcome and are recalculating their expectations in real time. The silence after 4 minutes had a different texture than the silence at 2 minutes would have had. What I had been doing in those 4 minutes was watching her form. The paired blade style had a structural preference. It loaded weight to the lead foot at the extension of the second blade sequence, and the recovery from that extension had a quarter-second lag that was not a weakness exactly, but was the only moment in the entire sequence where the line was not fully committed. I had no way to exploit it in the first round because I did not know it was there until I had watched her move at full speed for 4 minutes. Now I knew it was there. The interval between rounds was 3 minutes. I stood with my hands on my knees and breathed and thought about what the lag meant in terms of distance and angle, and what I would need to do to be in the right position to use it when it appeared. Second round, I lasted 6 minutes and 40 seconds before she scored. I had used the half-second lag twice. Neither exploitation was sufficient to score on its own, but I had moved correctly in response to it. I had been in the right position and had made the right motion, even though her counter was faster than my execution, and she had noticed. I saw it in her eyes when I moved correctly the second time. The slight recalibration of a specialist who has just learned something unexpected about an opponent she had already categorized. She was not alarmed, she was not worried, but she was paying a different quality of attention than she had been in the first round. The gallery had gone entirely quiet. Third round, I lasted 8 minutes and 1 second. I scored once, a clean point, correctly executed, the lag used at the right moment with enough preparation time that the motion landed before her counter could fully arrive. She scored twice. The trial was hers, 3 rounds to none on wins, but the point differential was the smallest it had been against any petitioner, and I had scored against the fortress's third-ranked single combat instructor, which I had not expected to be able to say when the round began. The gallery's silence continued for a moment after the third round ended. Then it broke into something that was not quite applause, Vel'Keth tournament tradition did not applaud the losing petitioner, but was a different quality of noise than what had come before. It had, in it, the sound of people revising something they had previously decided. Sarvath Aln said, when the third round ended, "You have no formal combat training." I said no. She said, "You were watching my form." I said yes. She said nothing further. She inclined her head. It was a Vel'Keth gesture that could mean several things, and I filed it without certainty about which one applied here. Later, Verath told me it was the gesture used when a specialist acknowledges that an opponent did something technically correct within their means. It was not praise. It was a form of professional recognition that the opponent had used what they had well. I found when Verath told me that it was enough. Standing in the courtyard after Trial 3 with the cumulative scores posted on the display panel, I worked out that I was in third place overall. Sorvin Khaleth was first. Draven Sorvin was second, by a margin slim enough that Trial 4 would determine which of us entered the fifth trial with the stronger position. The two noble sons were fourth and fifth, which was not competitive. The princess was in the gallery during Trial 3. I had been aware of her, the south end, the plain gray-blue, the sustained quality of attention that was different from entertainment. When the scores were posted, I looked up at the gallery briefly, not entirely meaning to, and she was there. She was not looking at the display panel. She was looking at the courtyard. At me specifically, though at the distance of the gallery I could not read her expression in detail. Her right hand was resting on the gallery rail, with the same deliberate carriage I had noticed in the corridor. I held her eyes for a moment. Then she looked away, back to the display panel, and I went inside. I went asleep that night thinking about Trial 4. Tactical Command was the trial I had the least framework for and the most to learn. I had never commanded soldiers. I had directed survey teams, 2 or 3 people, usually, moving through terrain with specific objectives, and a shared understanding that arguing with the person who knew the ground best was less efficient than following them. The Trial 4 scenario was different in scale but possibly not in principle. The 6 Vel'Keth House soldiers assigned to my squad were not recruits. They were mid-rank line infantry, competent, and they did not bother to hide their assessment of me when we were given the 30-minute scenario briefing. Their faces held the particular professional blankness of soldiers who have been ordered to follow someone they do not respect and are deciding how much cooperation to provide above the technical minimum. I looked at the scenario map. The objective was to secure 3 marked positions in the training ground, a converted section of the outer approach terrain, simultaneously, within a 2-hour window, with a notional opposing force that would be attempting to deny each position. The opposing force was also 6 soldiers, from the fortress's standard training cadre, familiar with the terrain. Every prior petitioner, I had been told in the briefing, had divided their squad into 3 pairs and assigned 1 pair per objective in a simultaneous 3-pronged approach. It was the obvious solution. It was also, looking at the terrain map, the solution that the training cadre had clearly been prepared to counter. The 3 objective positions formed a triangle with approach angles that, if you divided your force into pairs, left each pair without mutual support distance. I did not divide the squad into 3 pairs. I told them we were taking position 1 with full strength, holding it for 20 minutes to establish it as a committed objective, and then moving as a unit to position 2 while leaving 1 soldier to hold position 1, a rotation that would look, to anyone reading the scenario from the outside, like an overcommitment to the first objective. It would also pull the training cadre's attention to the wrong part of the terrain for the first 30 minutes. The soldier nearest to me, a woman with the rank insignia of a corporal, whose name I learned later was Verath, said, flatly, "That's not how this scenario is run." I said, "I know." She said, "The standard approach." I said, "The standard approach has been run 11 times in this tournament's history. The The training cadre knows its timing. I'd rather be unpredictable than standard. There was a silence. Then Vel'Keth said, not warmly but without the blankness, "What do you know about Vel'Keth infantry tactics?" I said, "Nothing useful, but I know what a defensive force does when it expects a split advance and gets a consolidated one instead. It doesn't react well." Another silence, then, "All right." We secured all 3 objectives. The first in 8 minutes, the second in 23, the third in the final 11 minutes of the window, which was tight enough that I would not want to run it that way again. The training cadre's response to the consolidated advance was exactly what I had expected. They committed heavily to position 1, expecting it to be the feint, and by the time they recalibrated, we had position 2 established with enough soldiers to hold it and enough mobility remaining to take position 3 before the window closed. Vel'Keth at the end said nothing. She gave me a full formal Vel'Keth soldier's nod, both hands, not just the right, and then walked back to the staging area. I stood in the training ground for a moment with the scenario complete and the evaluation team marking their boards, and I thought, well, all right, let's see how that scores. It scored well. Draven Sorvin's squad secured 2 of 3 objectives with a strong point differential on the 2 secured. Sorvin Vel'Keth secured all 3 in a faster time than mine, using the standard split approach, but with the physical domination of a warrior who could, at each objective, overwhelm the training cadre's response before they could capitalize on the mutual support gap. He was simply better at the trial than I was, and the training cadre had not expected the level of individual combat effectiveness he brought to a tactical exercise. Going into the 5th trial, Sorvin Vel'Keth was first overall. I was second. Draven Sorvin was third. The 2 noble sons had been formally retired from competition after trial 4 on scoring grounds. The court's reaction to the cumulative standings took a form I noticed, but did not fully understand until Vel'Keth explained it to me afterward. Vel'Keth tournament tradition held that the 5th trial was the princess's sole province. She chose the petitioners she would see, in order of their standing, and she was permitted to name a bonding claim after any petitioner's 5th trial or decline to name one and proceed to the next petitioner in line. In the 41 prior tournaments, no princess had ever named a bonding claim for a petitioner outside the first 2 in the standings. The court expected Vel'Keth Sorvin to name Sorvin Vel'Keth. The standing said Vel'Keth, and Vel'Keth was Vel'Keth, and Vel'Keth was built like a monument to everything the Vel'Keth court valued. What the court did not know, what I did not know until much later, was that Vel'Keth Sorvin had declined to name a bonding claim in the previous 2 tournaments, exercising the princess's right of refusal at the 5th trial for every petitioner in sequence. The tournament had been run twice in the past 6 years without producing a bonding claim. The sovereign court was, by this point, not patient about it. I did not know any of that going into the 5th trial. I knew the sequence: Vel'Keth first, Sorvin second, me third. I sat in the petitioner waiting chamber on the morning of the 5th trial, and I thought about what I knew of Vel'Keth Sorvin. I knew the corridor, 4 seconds, the amber eyes and the copper hair, and the careful carriage of the right hand. I knew the gallery's sustained attention, not entertainment but something different and more considered. I knew that she had watched 3 rounds of trial 3 from the gallery's south end without moving, and had been looking at the courtyard specifically at me when the scores posted. I knew that after trial 2 she had been standing at the gallery rail looking at the field for a sustained period, and that the quality of that attention had something in it that I did not know how to name precisely, but recognized as related to what I felt when I was reading a piece of terrain that was more interesting than I had initially expected. I did not know her governance record, her policy positions, her standing in the succession, her specific objection to the 2 prior tournaments' petitioners, or the nature of the nerve condition in her right hand. I knew what she looked like when she looked at something that interested her. It took approximately 2 hours before a court officer came to the waiting chamber, and told me that Sorvin Khalif's fifth trial had concluded, and that Draven Sorvin's had concluded, and that neither had resulted in a bonding claim. The court officer's face held the particular tension of someone managing a situation that was not going according to expectation. He was very professionally blank about it, but the blankness itself was informative. I was escorted to the fifth trial chamber. It was a smaller room than I had anticipated. No court, no gallery, no formal seating arrangement for noble house representatives. A high-ceilinged chamber in the fortress's interior, lit by a glass panel in the roof that brought in pale afternoon light, walls of the same dark stone as the rest of the fortress with mineral inlay catching the light in thin, cold lines. 2 chairs. A small table with water. Vithai Sorvin was already there, seated in one of the chairs, in the same plain gray-blue she had worn every day I had seen her. No court dress, no formal braiding, no sovereign ornamentation except the single narrow circlet of the Vel'Keth second heir worn at the left temple, understated enough that I noticed it now rather than when we'd been in the corridor. She was alone. No advisors. I sat in the other chair. For a moment neither of us said anything. The light from the roof panel moved slightly as cloud cover shifted outside. She was looking at me the way she had looked at the courtyard after Trial 3, not at me specifically, I thought, but at something she was still deciding. She said, in Vel'Keth standard, "They tell me you entered this tournament on a clerical error." I said, "Yes." She said, "And you chose not to withdraw." I said, "The costs were prohibitive, for the compact and for me personally." She said, "The costs for withdrawal from a tournament you did not enter voluntarily." I said, "Vel'Keth law doesn't distinguish between voluntary and involuntary entry. Once the witness seal is set, the petition stands." The archivist was very clear about it. She looked at me for a moment, then she said, "You finished second overall." I said, "Yes." She said, "Against a field that has been training for this tournament for 2 to 5 years." I said, "I'm aware." She said, "How?" It was not a question, exactly. It was more the specific Vel'Keth interrogative used when someone wants a mechanism, not a summary. I said, "I've been reading terrain since I was 22. Everything is terrain if you look at it the right way. The traverse had wind-exposed ridge versus sheltered intermediate shelf. The endurance carry was efficiency, not strength. The combat trial I lost, but I watched the form before I needed to use it. The tactical scenario was an opponent that expected a predictable approach." She said, "You watched the form." I said, "I had 4 minutes in the first round to learn it. It was the most useful 4 minutes of the trial." Something shifted in her expression. It was not a smile. It was the particular quality of attention that sharpens when recognition arrives, when someone hears a description that matches something they already know, and the match is real. She said, "The trial was 3 rounds." I said, "Yes." She said, "You lost all 3. I said, "Yes." She said, "But you watched." I said, "I wasn't going to win it by fighting harder. I was going to lose it less badly by learning more. Those are different projects." She was quiet for a moment. The light in the room had shifted again, the clouds outside moving at their own pace, indifferent to tournaments and bonding claims and the expectations of courts. She said, "I'm going to ask you the 5th trial question now." I said, "All right." She said, "What is the throne for?" I looked at her. I had been expecting something in the Vel'Keth governance tradition, a tactical question, a legal precedent, a test of familiarity with their succession code. The court questions I had been given to prepare in the briefing documents were extensive and specific: lines of succession, border treaty structures, house alliance obligations, sovereignty definitions under the Vel'Keth Covenant Charter. What is the throne for? I did not reach for the governance notes. I thought about the corridor. I thought about the 4 seconds and the amber eyes and the careful carriage of the right hand, the plain dress without court ornamentation, the gallery's south end, and the sustained quiet attention that was different from entertainment. I thought about 2 prior tournaments and no bonding claim and a court that was not patient about it. I thought about a second heir who could not hold a weapon due to a nerve condition that Vel'Keth ancient law categorized as a disqualification, and who had apparently spent the better part of 6 years declining to be bonded to the people the tournament kept producing. I said, it depends on what the person sitting in it is trying to do. She said, say more. I said, a throne is a tool. Like any tool, it does what the person using it directs it to do. If the person sitting in it is trying to consolidate power and protect their position, it's a consolidation instrument. If they're trying to govern, which is different, and not every person who reaches a throne seems to understand the difference, then it's a platform for seeing clearly and deciding accordingly. The elevation is supposed to improve the view, not substitute for it. She was very still. I said, I'm guessing the tournament produces petitioners who want the throne as a consolidation instrument. I'm guessing that's not what you're looking for. She said, why do you say that? I said, because you've declined twice, and because you've been watching these trials the way I watch terrain. You're not watching for who's strongest, you're watching for something else. She said, what am I watching for? I said, someone who knows what they're looking at when they look at a problem, someone who doesn't confuse the obvious approach with the correct one. I paused. I might be wrong. I've only watched you for a total of about 2 hours spread across 4 days, and most of that was from a distance and through the specific distortion of being in the middle of a trial. The stillness in her broke slowly, like ice releasing, not dramatically, not in a rush, but in the particular way that something long-held eases when it is no longer necessary to hold it. She said quietly, the throne is for looking clearly and deciding accordingly. I said, that's what I think. She was quiet for a moment. The light in the chamber had gone soft, the clouds outside thickening into afternoon overcast, the pale light through the roof panel becoming something even and gray, and somehow more intimate than the directional light of earlier. She said, your right hand. I said, pardon. She said, you favored your right hand during trials 1 and 2. I noticed it. The survey incident scar on your jaw, that's an old entry point. It healed straight, but the scar tissue around it moves differently on the left side of your face when you're calculating something. I've been watching that for 4 days. I said, I didn't know that. She said, most people don't notice how their own faces move. I said, what does it do when I'm calculating? She said, you go very still on the left side, and your eyes don't move to the thing you're actually looking at. They stay about 30 degrees off and you look at the target in your peripheral vision. I sat with that for a moment. I said, that's useful information. I'll try to correct for it. She said, don't. It means you're thinking seriously. I'd rather see that than someone performing confidence they don't have. The room was quiet. Outside, somewhere in the fortress, the sounds of the court continued, footsteps, voices, the particular ambient noise of a large institution going about its afternoon. But in the chamber it was just the 2 of us and the shifting gray light and what was becoming, with a slowness that felt earned rather than rushed, something I didn't have an immediate word for. She said, I'm going to name a bonding claim. I said nothing, I waited. She said, the court is going to have a significant reaction. I said, I expect so. She said, you understand what a Vel'Keth bonding claim means? I said, approximately. I read the tournament documentation. I'd want to understand the specifics better before anything formal. She said, that's a reasonable position. I said, I have a lot of questions. She said, I imagine you do. I said, I want to be clear that I'm not. I came here as a trade mission observer. I have a field notebook with 22 pages of observations about Vel'Keth diplomatic infrastructure, and not one word about bonding claims or throne succession. She said, I know, I read your mission manifest. I said, when? She said, day 2, after the traverse. I had the court archivist pull it. I sat with that. She said, you took the intermediate shelf on the river approach. I said, the wind was against the ridge. She said, yes, I know, I was watching from the overlook. A pause. The other petitioners didn't read the wind. I said, they were faster on the ridge when there wasn't wind. I read what was actually there rather than what the obvious route would give me. She said, yes. There was a quality to that word, not agreement, not confirmation, but something more specific. Recognition. The particular sound of someone hearing, in a concrete example, a description of something they have been trying to articulate for a very long time. She said, Kale Dorn. She said it in the Vel'Keth formal style, given name, then family name, both syllables of each receiving the full weight of the acknowledged presence address. Not a question, not an order, a name spoken as a declaration that the person it belonged to had been seen. I said, yes. She said, I name a bonding claim. The court officer outside the chamber door would have heard it. The claim was, under Vel'Keth law, complete from the moment of verbal declaration within the trial chamber. Whatever happened next, the documentation, the formal registration, the considerable administrative challenge of a bonding claim between a Vel'Keth second heir and a compact trade mission observer who had entered the tournament by clerical error, was subsequent to the naming, not prior to it. I said, I should tell you that I've never lived on Vel'Keth. She said, I know. I said, my knowledge of Vel'Keth governance tradition is adequate for a trade mission observation report and inadequate for a great deal more. She said, you learn by watching. I said, yes. She said, then you will watch and you will learn, and when you have questions I will answer them because that is what I would want if our positions were reversed. I said, that seems fair. She said, the court is going to be loud about this. I said, I expect so. She said, it will be loudest about the fact that you have no battle-braid and no formal combat rank and no Vel'Keth bloodline. I said, those seem like significant objections from their perspective. She said, yes. I said, what's your position on them? She looked at me. The amber eyes were very direct and very clear, and the light in the chamber had gone to the particular gray gold of afternoon cloud cover that softens everything without obscuring it. She said, my position is that I have a nerve condition in my right hand that prevents me from holding a weapon, which the ancient law reads as a disqualification, and I have been governing the Vel'Keth Eastern Border Protocol for 3 years from a platform that has no battle-braid requirement and produces results that the court's battle-braided advisors have not matched. My position is that the tournament has produced, twice in 6 years, petitioners who want the throne as a consolidation instrument, and that I decline them, and that the court's patience is not my responsibility to manage. A pause. My position is that you took the intermediate shelf on the river approach because you read what was actually there. I said, yes. She said, that is sufficient. The claim was named. The afternoon light continued to shift through the roof panel. Somewhere in the fortress the court was beginning, I imagined, to generate the noise that Vithai Sorvin had predicted it would generate. None of that had arrived yet. It was still just the chamber and the 2 chairs and the small table with water and the gray gold light. I said, I have a question. She said, go ahead. I said, the corridor, the first morning, we walked into each other. She said, yes. I said, you were going to the overlook. She said, yes. I said, you looked at me for about 4 seconds. She said, yes. I said, what were you deciding? She was quiet for a moment. Her right hand, resting in her lap with its careful carriage, did not move. The amber eyes were steady. She said, whether you looked like someone who read terrain or someone who ran the ridge. I said, "Could you tell in 4 seconds?" She said, "No, I had to watch the whole tournament." I sat with that. I said, "And?" She said, "You read the terrain." Outside the chamber, the court of Vel'Keth was loud about it, just as she had said it would be. Sorvin Khaleth's house filed a formal objection on the grounds of precedent and bloodline requirement. Draven Sorvin left the fortress that evening without ceremony, which I respected. He was a professional, and he had lost cleanly, and he had the dignity not to make it something larger than it was. The two noble sons said things to each other in the petitioner gallery that I was told about later, and did not find particularly distressing. The court archivist processed the claim documentation with the careful flatness of a man who understood that the law was the law regardless of the court's volume, and the claim was registered in the Vel'Keth sovereign record in the princess's own hand. She wrote his name, my name, in the acknowledged presence form, in the primary sovereign bonding register, with a notation that read, "Petitioner demonstrated understanding of the throne's purpose to the princess's sole satisfaction." Vel'Keth law required no further justification, because the fifth trial was the princess's sole province and always had been, and the court's objections, however loud, had no mechanism to override it. The registration produced a notation in the compact diplomatic register that caused a considerable amount of correspondence between the trade mission coordinator and the compact's cultural affairs office for the following 3 weeks. I read the correspondence later. Most of it reduced at the core to, "We are not certain this is what was intended when we sent a field observation specialist on a trade mission to Vel'Keth. It was not what was intended, but I have spent 15 years reading terrain that had no intention of cooperating, and I have found that what the terrain actually offers is sometimes better than what you plan to find there." Her name, spoken in the full Vel'Keth acknowledged presence form in a quiet stone chamber with gray-gold afternoon light, was Vithai Sorving. The amber eyes were clear and direct, and they had watched a 4-day tournament with the same patience I apply to ground I have not yet understood. She had read me more accurately than I had read myself. The way my face moves when I'm calculating, the deliberate carriage of a hand that requires managing, the particular peripheral vision pattern I had apparently been using for 15 years without knowing it, and she had waited until she had enough information before she named what she saw. I did not win the tournament because I was the strongest petitioner. I finished second. Sorvin Khaleth was first in the standings and a more accomplished warrior than I will ever be, and he deserved that standing, and I have no quarrel with it. I won the throne by answering one question plainly, in a small stone room with gray afternoon light, to a woman who had been asking it for 6 years, and had not yet received an answer she could believe. They called me weak. They called me prey. They said I had no battle-braid, no bloodline, no right to be in a tournament I hadn't entered on purpose. They were not entirely wrong about any of those specific things. But I took the intermediate shelf on the river approach because the wind was against the ridge. I watched Sarvath Alm's form for 4 minutes before I needed to use what I'd learned. I told Verath to forget the standard approach because the terrain rewarded the unexpected, and she gave me the soldier's nod at the end. And I sat in a small stone chamber with gray-gold light and a woman with amber eyes, and I said what I actually thought the throne was for. It was sufficient. That's how it started. That's how it ends, if ends is the right word, which I'm not sure it is, since we walked out of that chamber together into the court's considerable noise, and the noise is still ongoing in some of its forms, and the field notebook now has considerably more than 22 pages, and the grain tea, I have discovered, tastes better if you drink it while it is still hot. Vithai tells me I still look 30 degrees off when I'm thinking about something I care about. I have decided not to correct for it.